incredible. She can just talk about anything. I really enjoyed being with her today. This afternoon, what Rayna wants to talk with you about on a more informal basis is her work with the Vance Randolph material. She came here, I guess in the late 60s, early 70s, and got to know Vance Randolph and was interested in getting some of the, quote, obscene material that he had collected published, and I guess in 1973 did come out with the volume Pissing in the Snow, which she can tell you hilarious stories about the history of pissing in the snow, and it still has its own reputation. But she wants to talk with you about working with Vance and about that edition. And there are people in this room who also knew Vance Randolph, and I know a lot of the folklore students know that Vance Randolph was a collector of folklore in Missouri and in Arkansas, and we're very proud of the fact that we had such a great collector in Missouri. So I'm not going to give you long anecdotes about Rayna. Can't anyway. So I'm just going to let her talk to you now about Pissing in the Snow and about Vance Randolph.
I want to thank lots of old friends for bringing me here, Elaine and Rusty. There are people here who I know whose work I know, like Gordon McCann and Barry and Dolph Schrader, and people who I've met before, and I'm just really grateful to be here. So it's a real pleasure. The first time I had a chance to be at the university here, and there were places in Missouri that were very beloved to Vance, and I'll try to tell you about some of those, so it's been really a pleasure to be here. Vance Randolph changed my life. This is, in a peculiar way, a kind of testimony to a remarkable man, and to a man whose work has changed a discipline and contributed to the discipline of folklore in a way that I think is just uncalculable. He was an interesting man, just inherently. He was when he was a young man at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, come up from the Missouris, in essence, grown up in the Midwest and then sent away east to school. He became a journalist. He, of course, did attend classes at the University of Missouri School of Journalism in part, but never took a degree. There's some odd connections. He simply became a journalist, and as a journalist, he was a man who was interested in almost everything. And during his career, he wrote about almost everything. When he was a very young man, he was employed by a company in St. Louis, which became very famous, the Haldeman Julius Publication Company. I think Haldeman Julius is long gone now, but it was a fascinating publication company, and it produced a whole series of little blue books, and you'll still see them sometimes in garage sales and auctions, and people send them to me all the time. I have a whole collection of little blue books written by this young journalist, Vance Randolph. He wrote on sort of everything, and he became interested in everything, but most passionately in people. But he wrote little blue books for Haldeman Julius in St. Louis on the sex life of insects. He wrote little blue books on the lives of interesting people. He wrote a little blue book on bartenders in St. Louis. He wrote little blue books on school teachers and education. It's an amazing corpus of material. So here we have a man who really just simply wanted to report on what he saw in a very interesting world at a very interesting time. He came into professional journalism in the 1920s. He had a wide range of friends in and around the Ozarks, in and around Missouri and the Midwest, and in the East as well, but he quickly came to become passionate about the Ozarks, in fact, and he found the most interesting people here. Although there was a whole other side to Vance Randolph's world, people think of him as spending a lifetime interviewing very old, very traditional, very rural people in the Ozarks. But the real fact is that Vance had a very different, very diverse life. For a long period in his life, he was friends with and actually lived in the anarchist communes in St. Louis with Emma Goldman. And people who were regarded and who were, in fact, radicals of their time in the late teens and early part of the 20s and 30s. Amazing man, amazing intellectual community. These were people who were political radicals whose very existence was regarded as subversive. And at the same time, this was a man who went out into the country to interview country people about what they did and what they said and what they thought about and what they told about. So here was not a man who spent his life on a mule but packing back into the Ozark regions. Although he did that, I have a wonderful photograph of him about 1921 of Vance on a mule with two two side packs on, and going back, with a long pipe and a cowboy hat, packing back into fairly remote areas. But at the same time, here was a man who was living at the edge of communities that were regarded as deviant, as peculiar, and politically threatening. He was simply interested in them in the same way he was interested in people in the Ozarks. To him, they were no different. It was all part of a vast human variety, which absolutely fascinated him. And he never gave up that fascination with people. He was deeply passionate about every variety of human experience, and deeply funny about those varieties of human experience. When I first met him, I was a brand new PhD with my first job at the University of Arkansas. And if you'd gone through a folklore education course and you knew you were going to Fayetteville, Arkansas, you had to go make a pilgrimage to Vance's house. Well, I wasn't sure quite what to expect, except that I called and paid my respects to him over the phone, and with his wife, who was my colleague in the English department, who was in her own right a remarkable folklorist, Mary Celestia Parler. Mary Celestia, of course, was Vance's third wife. They both were then in their late 60s when I first met them. Vance was she was in her late 60s, Vance was in his early 70s. And she was just 1 year away from retirement. Vance had been ill for years when I first was able to meet him, and was pretty much a recluse in his house. He never went anywhere. He stayed in his house and never went anywhere. No one ever came to visit him. At that point in his career, professional folklore had pretty much written Vance off. Vance had produced his last books a number of years before. He was regarded simply as a regional folklorist, and at that point, with all the professionalism in folklore, there was very little interest in Vance, but still I felt I had to go and see him. So they invited me over. I was told at that point that by some other friends that if I really wanted to make friends with Vance, that I could acquire a good bottle of whiskey and go visiting, and that might endear me to him. And I did discover, I'm not going to tell many stories out of school. I don't want to shock and horrify you about this venerable man, but it was said by Mary Celestia and others of Vance's friends that the three things he loved most in his life besides Ozark folklore were whiskey and cigars and beautiful women. Well, I figured at least I could make it on the whiskey if I could share the cigars or the other passion. So I did acquire a bottle of good scotch and went over and sat on the porch with this man who I knew only by his books and by reputation. And I think from the very minute we sat down and began to visit that it was a kind of mutual respect and love that really did grow. Mary Celestia was a wonderful woman, and in her, as I said, in her own right, a remarkable folklorist. And between the two of them, what you could do when you visited them was to spend a remarkable period of time hearing remarkable stories from people who had led remarkable and very rich lives. And for me, going to a community of people who could tell stories the way Vance and Mary Celestia did was like going home. I came from a family of storytellers, particularly my grandmother, and it was simply like coming to a home that I recognized and knew would enrich my life as a folklorist, certainly, but enrich my life as an individual. And the stories I got were numerous, of all kinds. One about their collecting experiences in the South and in the Ozarks. Two, I got a lot of wonderful stories about other professional folklorists, which are mostly unrepeatable. And that was edifying and enriching for a young folklorist who did, of course, want to hear about all those people who had taught me, and people of the past whom I had never had a chance to meet. And Vance had known them all, of course, and Mary Celestia had known them, and it was wonderful to sit on that porch and hear these stories. What else I got was a very rich dose, I think, of what it would be like to be the kind of folklorist that I hope I am. Because what I got from them was a great lesson in the humane nature of folklore and of folklore scholarship. It wasn't theory. It wasn't an intellectual exercise. It was, I think, an exercise in dealing with other human beings and in hearing and seeing what they had and what they had so richly. And that was the thing that captivated me forever. I guess I needed that after being years and years in graduate study, which does something wonderful for your mind in terms of books, but doesn't do the kinds of things for your heart always that you need doing when in fact you're going to work with human beings who don't come out of books, who come out of a real life experience. And for me, that was what working with Vance and Mary Celestia meant. And we spent lots of long hours on that porch long before I ever raised the issue of Vance's enormous body of unpublished works. Before that period, what I did discover was a side of Vance that would later become very important to a lot of people. Vance was not only a collector of stories and songs from human beings, he was a collector of stuff. And in their tiny little house in Fayetteville, Arkansas, there were walls and cabinets and shelves crammed with a remarkable and amazing amount of stuff. One of the things that I discovered Vance had was every letter which had ever been written to him, and copies of every letter he had written everybody. Well, let me tell you, a young scholar sort of looks at this stuff and says, dear heaven, there are books here, books that will never be written, and a history of folklore scholarship and a history of other disciplines. Vance had in his time corresponded with some of the major intellectual figures of this country, people at major institutions, people who have very famous names and written books. I would go through these files, and he would just pick out file folders, and he'd say, let me tell you about this guy, and he'd pick out a file folder, and there in the file folder would be this wonderful correspondence between Vance and George Lyman Kittredge of Harvard, one of the great literary figures of the early part of the century, a major and influential figure in early literature and folklore literature. And here would be this folder of letters and correspondence between these two people. And it was enriching in a way that simply reading about these folks I never dreamed it would be. And that was the way it went for months after months after months. And we would spend time, these file cabinets would unfold and the shelves would unfold, and there would be little books that I had never been able to see before that no library would have, and on and on and on. So it was like having a second education. It was also great fun. And one day, I guess I looked at all this stuff, and I looked at Vance, who was getting older, and he said to me, Mary Celestia and I are moving to a retirement home. We're too old to take care of ourselves anymore. I'm ill, Mary's going blind, and she was, in fact, with glaucoma. We can't live here anymore. And he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make a big bonfire out in the back. And he says, we'll get a bottle of whiskey and let's burn all this up. Well, that was typically Vance. And I must have looked so shocked and appalled. I said, Vance, burn all this up, your life's work, all those letters, everything? Can you really burn it up? Hell yes, he said. Let's have a big bonfire. We'll have a hell of a good time. I said, Vance, no, you can't burn it up. He said, who'd want it? Who'd want it? I said, your papers have got to be put somewhere where people can understand 50 years, 100 years later what you did and what other people did and what they said. My librarian's soul sank. I could see the bonfire. Nobody would want this stuff, he says. It's just a bunch of old letters between a bunch of old men. I said, Vance, you weren't old men when you wrote them, and besides, libraries and disciplines and whole histories have been built on a bunch of letters by a bunch of old men. I said, we've got to put it somewhere. Well, none of those folklorists will want this stuff, he says. None of the folklorists will want this stuff. I said, Vance, I'm one. We've got to do something with it. Well, we talked lots about it, and he kept threatening to burn it all until one day I finally said to him, Vance, this is going to go someplace. Trust me. I said, if I can make an arrangement, will you let me sort it out and send it off someplace? Well, he says, if you're going to take the letters and you're going to take the rest of the stuff, he says, you can have the books and stuff. And to this day, my library in folklore, by the way, has a large chunk of the collection from Vance. If you're going to take the rest of that stuff, what are you going to do with all that dirty stuff? You mean the volumes of obscene stuff from the Ozarks? Yeah, he says, what are you going to do with all that? He says, no library wants that. They'll put it in the so-called Delta collection where it's hidden away. Nobody wants that. What are you going to do? There's tons of it, boxes full. Here, he says, I'll show you. And out came in 5 small boxes, little old metal pack trunks, all of the volumes of the material that I had heard so much about, and that I had in fact seen at the Kinsey Institute in Indiana University. There are only 5 extant manuscript copies of all this stuff. Vance had kept one set. And I'll tell you where the other sets are. And I said, he says, what are you going to do with all this? Library of Congress won't take this. He says, only place you can put it is the Vatican, where they do have large collections of such stuff, I'm told. I said, Vance, there's something we're going to have to do about this. Why won't you publish it? Tell me about it. And the long story began to unfold then of his attempts in the books that he had published all of those years to have the so-called dirty stuff put in with the regular collections. But no one, of course, would ever let him do it. And so he kept pulling it out sheet by sheet, piece by piece, and saving it in manuscript form. For what purpose, he didn't know. He only knew that he had to save it. He had collected it, it existed, and deserved some place. And it was in these little sort of notebook binders and carbon copies. No Xerox machines, of course, when he had started saving all this, so it was all carbon copied, 5 copies. I said, what happened to it all? You got the manuscript copies. And he said, well, the Kinsey Institute has one. They bought one from me years ago. The Library of Congress has one set. Kenny Goldstein, the folklorist of Pennsylvania, has one set. And Gershon Legman, the scholar who lives in France, has another. He bought the rights to some of this from me years ago and said he would publish it, but it's never been published. I kept the rights to the story volume, the volume that we now all know is Kissing in the Snow and the Ozark Folktales. I said, Vance, it's 1971. I said, this compulsive, yes, it's pushed off. It'll ruin my reputation, it'll ruin your reputation, it'll ruin the reputation of the Ozark people. Well, that's a charge. What if it was respectable? What if it was a serious academic press? What if I wrote a serious, unlovable, heavy, what if that would make it respectable? people need to see this because it was part of the book. It is part is a picture of some part of the people say you do. Which you it's all kinds of scholarship on Vance and his work came from that publication of the folktale volume, which wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So many things have come from that. One of the things that came from it was the piling up of quite a little endowment. Pissing in the Snow has 10 years later, well 12 years later, still in print. It became an Avon paperback soon after Illinois issued it in hardback, and it is just now being remaindered in the houses. So this is unusually long-lived for an academic book, particularly a book by an academic press. And it's still in circulation. I was telling Elaine, in fact, I hear about it in strange quarters. Apparently a colleague of mine who found it in an airport bookshop has begun to pass it around to all his colleagues in the carpentry shop and the electrician shop at the Smithsonian, and it has become kind of a cult book. And I had guys from the carpentry shop walking up to me in the staff cafeteria saying, boy, that's the best book I ever read. And Vance has a whole new life, once again. And he has a whole new life with students and people who see this material and who can enjoy the good laughs it provides, and at the same time think about a whole world that he wrote about that had to be undercover for a long time. Well, the book still lives on in a unique way now. When Vance died, his income, of course, all the income largely from Pissing in the Snow and the residuals from many other books years before, went to Mary Celestia, his wife. She moved to South Carolina, and she died the year after. And she had done as Vance had wished, which was then to endow a scholarship for a student from the Ozarks at the University of Arkansas. So in some peculiar way, the Ozark people that Vance loved so dearly and who entertained him for so many years, and on whose lives he based the books, now can benefit in some way from that. And that scholarship, the endowment, is big enough that it can go on interminably, as far as we know. It is well endowed enough that we can support a student through 4 years of college every year from now till as long as we know the University of Arkansas will be up. So that kind of endowment is no mistake, and I like to think that Vance, who dearly loved education and dearly loved books and dearly loved the people of the Ozarks in his life, has some little legacy left. The other legacy that is left, of course, is all the work. Much of his work has now come back into print again. The folk songs originally published by Bell and Missouri Folklore Society now have been reissued. There is a whole new life of Vance Randolph's work out there, republished and reissued over and over again, and much scholarship afterwards. I like to think that early few months on his porch in Arkansas enabled, through me, at that time a very young scholar, now slightly middle-aged scholar, to become inspired enough to do things that were
important for his work, but at the same time important for the discipline of folklore. And a whole generation of people after that have been able to have access to that work. The bulk of the obscene materials still remain unpublished, tied up in copyright quarrels with Gershon Legman. I don't know if we will ever get them published. It is my hope, at least in my lifetime. Maybe some young scholar will come after me and make that possible. But it remains unpublished. The folktale volume is the only one that's been published, and there are several other volumes of outrageous material which still are extant, plus a number of other extant manuscripts that Vance wrote and never published. So there's still Randolph material yet to come, yet to be published, and yet to have, I think, another kind of life. What's important about the obscene material? Well, nothing so much as simply this: it filled in the record. It's not in and of itself important. There's nothing particularly unusual about it. It simply was the vehicle for setting a record straight that hadn't been set straight before. What is important, I think, is the huge body of material that Randolph collected in the Ozarks, which is not dead. It's still alive in many parts. And it's alive, I think, in the good hands of the Flightley Reserve Folklore Society, which has a caretakership, if you will, a kind of respect for his work and for the region, which continues to live. There are a number of folklorists and older folklorists certainly who now have begun to write on these materials and who will continue to do so. I like it brought attention to a region of the country which in many ways consigning of the Ozarks to another kind of trash heap. Say this is a backward and rural area which does not have any culture. It's only an elite culture which has the kind of culture that we're interested in. Randolph's work made it possible for us to see this culture and these cultures here in an entirely different light, and to continue now in the esoteric places like the carpentry shops of the Smithsonian Institution, to continue to have a life which entertains people, yes, but which I think gives them a view of a world that's not dead. It's alive and well and living out in Missouri and living in Arkansas, and which had a kind of dignity to it offered by the respect of a good man like Vance Randolph, a good journalist and a good friend. I have pinned up on my bulletin board, and sort of in perpetuity at home, that little note that says, "She can have it, it's hers," and a little red heart up in the corner. He wasn't a sentimental man very often. What he was a man who cared about the world he saw, and he wanted simply to report on it. I don't think those are bad goals at all. In fact, what we have from Vance now is the kind of intensified look at a world that enables us to see something different that we would never have seen had it not been for him. Well, I want to stop and open this up to questions or comments on the work. I know a lot of you have read some of his work, and a lot of you knew him on his board, and certainly did other people. He was a bad little guy. You would have liked him.
Tell us your favorite obscene story.
I promised I would.
That's why I came.
I was afraid of that. I've tried to keep this I've tried to keep this on a refined level. The thing about those stories, it really, I won't tell you one of them. The thing that has always struck me about them is that they are so common and so widespread. I've heard my own grandmother tell large numbers of them. I mean, to me, they were
they were just the stories that the people I grew up with told in their lives, and that's the sort of wonderful thing about them. Some of them are pretty rough to tender ears, but in fact, the country people who told Vance those stories were themselves not a rowdy and bawdy people to trust Vance enough to tell him those things, to write down in his book that newspaper man from St. Louis was an act of trust. One thing, I was telling Elaine this, and she didn't know it, a big chunk of the stuff he collected, by the way, is from women. People are shocked to hear that, but those ladies, I guess while Paul was out in the back 40 plowing, sat in that kitchen and burned his ears up. And he told me, when he first started collecting this stuff, he concealed that fact, that much of it was told to him by women, and later on, then he did make the attributions for who told it to him. But it was amazing. They must have had a great deal to say, and were just dying to tell someone, because when this brash young newspaper man from St. Louis would ride up on his horse, or later on drive up in his old Model T, they would sit down and tell him this stuff, and in his accounting of it, sit in the kitchen and laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh, and then when someone else came in, straighten up and be just as prim and proper as they could possibly be. So he must have had a way about him that was, and I can guarantee it, it's absolutely true, he was irresistible. You would not meet him and not tell him everything you knew. But he was a reporter too. He was like an investigative reporter. He could worm stuff out of you before you knew you told it to him. He'd be reporting for People magazine if he was alive, and printing all the scandalous things that people wouldn't tell anybody else. I'm sure he would be the Barbara Walters of his day, or the Mike Wallace. But he had a way about him that was irresistible, and as I said, he had a way with women. He could get them to tell things that they would have been embarrassed to tell anybody else. I think it's probably, I say this, you have to understand the context of this. I think he deeply loved women for all the right reasons. He had a sort of interesting perspective on women, and he liked smart women, and so he would all of his wives, the last one was sort of remarkable too, and I think he simply had a facility for getting women to tell him things, and some of the things they told him were amazing. Even very secret and very private stuff about medicine, for example. And if you read his other work, you have to read all the rest of the work to know how much they told him. Just enormous amounts of stuff. And they told him very private things about medicine and herbs and things that they would not, I think, ordinarily tell people. But the obscene stuff, I think, really does jolt you when you realize how much of it did come from ladies that might not have said those things ordinarily in front of anyone but other women. But Vance sat there in the kitchen and heard a lot of it. And some of it was sort of eye-watering when you think about it. I'm not telling you. I'm not telling you.
Rayna, is there an Ozark character, like when you were selecting for Pissing in the Snow, those stories and jokes, and talk about the genre?
I didn't select.
Who did?
There was no selection. I took what Vance had collected.
So
there is no editing.
Okay, so tell them just what's in Pissing in the Snow. Would you call it all? You said folk tale. Is that what? How
well, some of them are sort of, I think, what any folklorists would call jokes. But some of them are long stories that you will find, in collections that have a history back in Europe, back in Ireland. And there's some of them that are very venerable folk tales that you find distributed all over the world. I mean, the classic meat and potatoes of folklore. And some of them aren't. I don't know. It's hard to never know what to call this material. I call it bawdy material because it deals with the earthy things of life. It deals with sex, it deals with bodily functions, it deals with all these things. Some of it's not obscene in the sense of an inappropriate commentary on human life. That's the sense I always got out of it, that some of it was simply laughing at human folly. And I think that's what has to come through some of those stories that interest me a great deal. It's not mean. It's not, it doesn't inappropriately comment on people's behavior. Some of it is just about silly people. And a lot of folklore is about silly people that make us laugh. And the fact that it has to do with sex or with bodily functions or other things is no commentary on, I think, on people's obscenity. It's a commentary on the normal conversation of people who lived lives that had very few pretensions. When you work in barnyards, when you work with animals, there are things that are fairly common, and people weren't silly about them. They didn't attempt to cover up in their language the things that are fairly normal for people to see when they live a fairly rural life. Especially when you live the way people did in those rural areas where you might have, 10 kids and ma and pa and grandma and grandpa in the same place. We weren't as, you couldn't be as prudish about the human behavior as you might be, because everything is right there. And so I think it's a gloss really on normal human behavior as it was lived by people who lived a certain way. So I don't think of some of it as obscene. Also, in terms of the sort of the Ozark character, I don't know if there is one apparent from that. To me, growing up in Texas and Oklahoma, I am from the Oklahoma Ozarks in around Tahlequah. So to me, that was the way people are. It wasn't anybody special. But of course I realize when I say that in a tea room, a tea salon in Boston, that it is different. It is quite different. And people are shocked. When I report to people some of the things my grandmother said, I've written about my grandmother, who was a remarkable storyteller. When I report some of the things that she said to scholars in the East, they said, well, my grandmother would have never said those things. I think, well, gee, what a deprived childhood she must have had. She must have been boring. What else did she tell you? Nothing, they say. Well, I mean, if there is a character there, I think a lot of it has to do with a rural life that simply comments on what life is like among people who live like that. So I don't know about an Ozark character. I wish I could ever derive that, but there is something that is different about that world. But that world also sang, 40 verses of tedious ballads with totally polite language and pretensions about a life that they had never seen. So, what kinds of contradictions there must be to sing about a prince or a king that you never saw hundreds of years ago in Ireland, and at the same time to talk about human sexual behavior in the way in which you saw it. I mean, it's a real contradiction. And maybe that doesn't happen in the Boston Tea Room either, I don't know.
What I was thinking was like the Arkansas Traveler story, where you get the idea that, well, most of those kinds of stories, you have a tension set up between the insider and the outsider,
Sure.
and the insider comes out on top and smarter.
Oh, yeah.
And so we have this stereotype of the Ozarkian, and then I wondered if in the stories you perceive their own notion of themselves as maybe smarter than the rest of the world, or I don't know. There's a lot of that goes on, because there are a lot of the stories in the work are about people who are made fools of by someone who is clever or smarter than they are. But often it's a commentary, people who are made fools of in one's own family, for example.
So brother and sister have a kind of one-upsmanship going on, or grandma and the grandson, or, you know, so it's a way of commenting on your own people as well. And what constitutes being smart. You know, if you were really clever, you wouldn't do this dumb thing. You know, there's a lot of that in all those stories. But they're no different than the clean stories in that respect. They're absolutely no different. It just so happens that the particular instance of being stupid may involve a sexual mistake, mistaking grandma for the beautiful girl down the road, for example, which does happen quite often in there. Or grandma who doesn't make any mistake at all, but gets what she wants through tricking younger and stupider people. As I said, those are no different from the clean stories. They're the same kinds of stories. People tricking people, people getting the better of other people, people being made fools out of, insiders, outsiders. It's all about human folly. I really, you know, if you want to put it that way, it's kind of little textbooks on how to behave or how not to behave in this instance. So I don't see them, you know, in any different kind of way. I do see a lot of, there is an image of one of them that's fairly pervasive is the image of the country boy or the country girl, and commenting on their own lives, you know, how dumb you can be, and there's a lot of that goes on. So there is some self-image, but most of it I never see it as having to do with self-image so much as in terms of region, for example, us versus them, except city country a little bit, but I don't see much else going on there. They just come from particular places and particular times. Yeah.
Is there anything distinctively different between, say, the Cherokee or Native American culture and their humor in that part of the Oklahoma Ozarks and the Anglo-Ozark culture? Because I've heard some Native American humor is totally different that I've heard, especially Southwestern. I don't know much about Cherokee, but could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there is a lot of difference. Although Oklahoma Cherokees, I mean, we share a lot of the same, my family there shares a lot of the same stories that we've learned from Anglos. So a lot of the stories are similar. Sometimes they'll make them just a little more Cherokee. I mean, the dummy might be Creek, for example, of course, or Creek or Comanche or Kiowa or one of the other tribes, never us. We just change the story slightly. But yeah, Indian humor in general, I think, is very different. You might have some of the same outrageous stories, and you know, there's a sort of history of the collection of Indian folklore that parallels the collection of obscene folklore. That is, that when they collected it, people would edit it out and remove it, you know. So they would collect outrageous things from Indians, things that Anglos thought were obscene, inappropriate, disgusting. And when the collection of Indian folklore came out, when the collection of folktales came out, all you had was the nice cleaned up versions, the nice sort of fairy tales, you know. For example, it was a long time before people would publish any of the coyote stories that are really quite outrageous and tales about the things coyote really does as opposed to the things that are acceptable to talk about. But yeah, I would say in general Native folklore is very different, and the sense of humor is really quite different. But there's some things that are still the same. Fools get made fools of, and insiders and outsiders. You know, they're all those too. But Cherokees do tell many of the same tales that I heard that are in the Randolph collections, because of our real. We've been in the Ozark area since the late 1820s. 1832 was the end of removal. We've been here a long time, and at the same time, of course, our people had interacted with Scots and Scotch-Irish in North Carolina. You can tell by Cherokee family names. My family name is Burns. So Burns, Ross, McDonald, all of those names were fairly common among Cherokees. And we took many of their stories, as they did ours, of course. So there are some real similarities. We're sort of notoriously good fiddle players as well. We learned all that from the Scots. So it all comes you know, one thing comes with another. It's of a piece, and the Cherokee fiddlers were fairly well known up until the 20s and 30s, actually, when people started coming off radio and going on public appearances, and then they were asked to step aside for Anglo fiddlers, but they were quite well known, and some of those old stories are fairly well known. Not much ballad singing or anything else, but the stories, yeah.
Is there a trickster figure in the Ozark stories at all, ever?
I've never, not to my knowledge, except the clever country boy or the clever city boy, you know, or there is a kind of figure, or grandma, yeah, tonight I will really talk about a grandmother figure in terms of Native American folklore. She is the one who gets away with everything, always. Rarely made a fool of. She is the bad old lady who can do anything she wants. We should all live so long. Actually, I was going to say one other thing. The Cherokee folklore. One of the things we also did was interact very heavily with blacks in the coastal South, and you have the Cherokees telling tar baby stories and rabbit stories. So people intermix and interact, but they don't take everything from one culture. They just pick and choose. Now, why that is some interesting speculations. But perhaps you take things that are you're most comfortable with because you have similar things in your own story repertoire. But lots of the stories that are in Randolph collections we find in Cherokee collections. Now, we do have a trickster figure called Jackson. The same word in Cherokee, we have the same word in Cherokee for devil and Jackson, Andrew Jackson, who removed the Cherokee people. Jackson, that's no accident. And Jason is the trickster figure. He does bad things and does dreadful things to ladies and comes and does inappropriate things.
This is like Coyote?
Yeah, it's
animal, human?
Well, he's neither animal nor human. Jackson is a kind of monster. He's a sort of transformed figure. He's no recognizable critter, unlike the Algonquin rabbit or coyote or raven in the northwest coast. Raven's another one. We also have a character called Thunder, who is Thunder, but Thunder is our friend, and Thunder always intervenes for our benefit. Thunder is the protector of the Cherokee people. And so when we hear thunder, we don't think of bad things, but rather that Thunder's there paying attention to us and watching over us because he is our friend. And it's a very different concept. Yeah?
I was wondering how a lot of the specific jokes and stories have been found alive in other geographical regions, like the pissing in the snow story. We talked about that one. I've heard it numerous times
Yes.
with different politicians.
And it's alive and well in contemporary versions. I heard, actually the first time I ever heard that story before I heard it or read it in the Randolph collection was a joke told about Nixon and Khrushchev and Pat Nixon. It's in her handwriting, you know. The
Oh, come on,
inscription in the
Brenda,
snow.
tell at least that one. Gil already left mad. I mean, he came here to hear dirty stories. Y'all know that. But you could tell that it's the title one.
Yeah, well, actually, I'd rather not tell any version of the story, but really to look at the story, which is a relatively simple story. In the Randolph version, it's a young man who is in love with a young woman, and her father does not wish them to marry, and he wants the young man to go away. And finally, the boy's father comes up to negotiate with the other father, saying that he knows he doesn't like him, but surely he could forgive him for all of his youthful errors and so forth. And the father says, "No, I cannot. No, I cannot. Why, only last week, you know, I looked outside the cabin, and there written in, you know, there written in the snow, you know, was a don't even remember the inscription in the Randolph story, but something obscene about me. You know, I can't forgive him that. And he said, oh, surely you could forgive him. I mean, he's just a boy, and he does these youthful pranks. You know, surely you can. He says, no, I cannot. No, I cannot. It was in my own daughter's handwriting. You know, so that's the core story. And I've heard it again. Like I said, there are versions about Nixon and Khrushchev and the inscriptions in Pat's handwriting. You know, and they're contemporary versions. It seems to have a life of its own. That's one of the few, though, that I've heard in lots of different versions everywhere. Now, ask yourself why. Why is that story so appealing? We all love to play tricks on our elders, I guess. And there's something wonderfully punky about it.
Was that Vance's choice to choose that as the title story, or?
Well, you know, that's actually interesting. Boy, by the way, you should have seen the debates we had at Illinois Press over the cover. The cover. What do you do?
Don't you have trees or something? You ended up with trees?
Well, that's the Avon paperback.
Oh.
The Illinois hardback just has this wonderful gray screened picture of Vance. You know, it's kindly only with a big white mustache, but we just sort of chickened out. But the Avon paperback has a kind of forest scene and a snowbank, and you just have to. There, yes, thank you. There's the Avon. Well, isn't it wonderful? Fans out there. But really, the debates over the cover were hilarious. They went on interminably. But the title was what Vance gave the manuscript. It was that story, and that's what he called it. And we had enormous debates when we were going to publish a book about whether that, but that's how everybody knew it in the discipline. That's what it was called. And usually people were referring to the whole 6 or 7 volumes of obscene materials, but in fact it refers only to the story volume. And we finally got, in the letters of testimony that got it published, people said, absolutely, you must call it that. Well, what happened, of course, once it was published, this is some very funny incidents. It was reviewed all over the Ozarks. Every newspaper in every city in the Ozarks reviewed it, but most would not print the title. So it was P blank 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 G in the snow and other Ozark hotels. And they go ahead and review it. You know, it's this wonderful collection of obscene tales, but without ever using any of the language from the book or anything. It was very funny. And the Washington Post refused to review it. Larry McMurtry, the novelist who wrote Terms of Endearment and all this, wanted to review it. The Washington Post said, "We're a family newspaper, we don't." But the title was the title it had from the very beginning, and a number of folklorists agreed that that was the way it was known in the literature, so that's what we used. And of course, you know, it has funny effects. I mean, it sells a lot of books. For people who don't know, there's a stuffy introduction, these stuffy footnotes. You know, they don't care. They pick it up in the airports to read because it is what it is. And they don't notice the introduction of footnotes. But for those who need the footnotes, it's also there. There are all kinds of funny stories about it.
I know someplace in the Ozarks it's just called Pitts. Mm-hmm. It's just called Pitts, P-I-T-S.
Oh, no,
yeah.
Well, Pitts, pitting in the snow, was the acronym that we began to refer to it, and Vance even refers to it in a couple of his little notes to me. It says, he calls it Pitts. And so we began to refer to it like that, and that may have carried over.
Yeah.
Did you ever see a day when all this stuff would be naturally wedded back together the way it was collected?
I would love for someone to do that. If there's ever a reissue of Vance's work, we do know when he collected things. The dates are on them. He was very good. He wasn't the journalist. And it would be my dream to see it merged in the places and ways it was collected, so that people wouldn't get such a skewed notion of it. You know, I always think it's somewhat of a dubious honor, even though I love the material, even the lady who printed the dirty book. I simply did it because it was there and it needed to be seen, but what I would love to see happen is to have it all put back together the way it really was, so that what you have is a much bigger picture of the way people talked and a whole range of things. And so, like I said, some young scholar's going to come along and do that. It's going to be wonderful. It'll be wonderful. And I think at some point there ought to be a kind of variorum edition, if you will, of Randolph's work. I think it merits it. Maybe that's y'all's task. It would be just marvelous to see it. Because the stuff is there, and it should be put back right. Vance never wanted to see it published separately. It bothered him. At the same time, he was so angry that it couldn't see, he thought it would never see publication in his lifetime. But he did see at least the one. And the songs are all there, and rhymes and games, and I wish Gershon Laban would let it go so we can let's see. If you thought the stories were worse.
Are there other questions? Maybe you should just stop, and there's more coffee and cookies if you just want to come up and ask her questions or two in there.
In the corner, she'll tell us.